Aloha, and welcome to the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies Take 20 event. I am Lieutenant Commander Christine Brown, and the Take 20 program is one in which we explore various transnational crime issues. Today's topic is a behind-the-scenes look at regional management fisheries organizations. Before we start, I would like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. We have a non-attribution policy for comments made by any speaker during the webinar. The speaker's comments do not necessarily reflect the views of DKI APCSS or the US government, and we ask that you post your questions and comments into the chat. The DKI APCSS is partnering with the Pew Charitable Trusts to present today's discussion on regional management fisheries organizations. Our featured speakers today are Ms. Gina Fiore and Ms. Esther Wozniak from Pew Charitable Trusts. Gina Fiore is a principal associate with the Any Illegal Fishing Project. She manages projects related to illegal fishing and convergence crimes and acts as a liaison between Pew and the military and national security communities. Before joining Pew, she worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, managing illegal fishing and information sharing projects for the U.S. Navy's Executive Agent for Maritime Domain Awareness. She also spent 5 years as a staff officer with the U.S. Department of Defense. She has bachelor's degrees in history and political science from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and master's degrees in history and political science from the New School for Social Research. Esther Wozniak is a principal associate with Pew's International Fisheries Project, working to reform high seas longline fishing by improving transshipment regulation and monitoring longline fisheries. She focuses on advocacy efforts within countries with regional fisheries management organizations and with United Nations agencies to ensure the sustainability of global fisheries. Before joining Pew, Esther worked on the intersection between ocean science and policy at the University of the South Pacific, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. She holds a bachelor's degree in marine science from the University of the South Pacific, Fiji. Gina and Esther, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that welcome, Christine, and thank you for having us. Before we move forward, I think I just wanted to give everyone a sense of how we were hoping this would run. I know at this point, 2 years into the pandemic, folks are probably webinared out. So Gina and I thought it might be helpful if instead of a bunch of slides and presentations, we'll have a little bit more of a conversation. There will be a few slides showing some of the things that we're talking about just to help paint the picture. But for the most part, we're hoping that this will be more interactive if it's just a conversation between a few colleagues on this matter. So with that, I'll jump right in to what is an RFMO. So a regional fisheries management organization, I'm only going to say that once, and then from now on it's just RFMO because it is a mouthful, is an international body made up of countries that share practical and or financial interests in managing or conserving fish stocks in a particular region. And these are usually made up of full cooperating members, but they also have non-cooperating members cooperating non-members. And these are countries that have only very specific interests in a region. I'll give you the example of Liberia and Panama. They tend to be cooperating non-members for a lot of the tuna RFMOs because their particular interest tends to be transshipment. So usually that's transfer of fish between vessels. And what they provide is a registry for a bunch of countries to be able to have their vessels flagged to Liberia and Panama. Usually these are carrier vessels that then receive catch from a bunch of other fishing vessels within these regions. And the main difference between a cooperating non-member and an actual full member at an RFMO is usually the non-members tend to be less vocal. And if there's ever a vote, they don't vote. But we'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. Now, looking at the full members, cooperating members, These are usually made up of coastal states and distant water fishing nations. And these coastal states are where the fish, usually this is where the fish is, and then the distant water fishing nations travel to these areas to where the fish is found. And I'll give you the example of the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, where the coastal states are the Pacific Islands, and then the distant water fishing nations, you have the US, EU, and countries from Asia that travel there to catch fish. Together, all these countries come to these RFMOs. This is where they meet to put in place management measures for that region. There are about 17 RFMOs in total, but Pew focuses a lot of our efforts on the 5 main tuna RFMOs. So I'll ask Darren if he could just pop up the first slide, and this should show you where we work. And it's really easy to figure out what region based on the name of the RFMOs. You have the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, the International Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, so that's in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, and then you have the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, and then the Commission for Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna. That last one doesn't really have a convention area, but mostly focuses on where Southern Bluefin Tuna is found, because that's where that's the main species it covers for this RFMO. The other 4 that we mentioned, they have a little bit of a wider mandate and focus on tuna fisheries, some of the bycatch species, and other species that interact with their target catch. So you can see from this slide that together, these 5 tuna RFMOs cover about 90% of the world's ocean. And so this is where we focus a lot of our efforts in the hopes that we will make the most impact. But it's also worth noting that Pew engages to a lesser extent at the North Pacific Fisheries Commission and the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization. And these 2 RFMOs mostly focus on squid. They're also newer, so that comes with some of its challenges, but then also an opportunity to help them craft their management measures as they're doing it for the first time. So that's a very quick snapshot of the tuna RFMOs where we work. I will now hand it over to Gina to talk about IUU fishing and give you some additional context of what that means at the RFMOs.
Thanks, Esther. So the other half of this conversation is about IUU fishing in the RFMOs. IUU fishing is short for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So a lot of times you'll hear it just shortened to illegal fishing. Sometimes you'll hear it called pirate fishing. There was an article out today with a headline about pirate fishing. But shortening it just to the illegal part, which is just one bucket, really does disservice to the many other issues that fall under the unreported and the unregulated terms. Illegal fishing is a problem, but I would argue that unreported and unregulated fishing can be just as, if not more important, depending on where you are. And I think we'll get into that, I think, a little bit later. Darren, if you could pop up the second slide. There it is, right there. So what is IUU fishing? These are the technical definitions as put together from the UN's Food and Agricultural Office in their International Plan of Action to prevent, deter, and eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This most recent update to the definition is from 2017. So what do each of the letters mean? So the I is illegal. That's a vessel that's been caught with fraudulent documents. That's a vessel that's fishing in an EEZ or in an RFMO without authorization. That is what you hear about the most when you're reading the news and you read about illegal fishing. But the other 2, again, just as important. The first U is unreported. That's misrepresentation of catch. That's either through saying, I I caught this one fish, when really it's another fish. That sometimes we call that fish laundering. Or some falsifying how much fish was actually caught. That's a lot of times it's a way to circumvent quotas, especially in an RFMO. And then the other U is unregulated. And that is just fishing in an area that has no regulation. And usually that's in a high seas area that isn't necessarily within the remit of an RFMO. This can be an issue with some species such, again, as squid. You probably hear us talk about squid a bit today. Some areas where there are squid fisheries are not managed by an RFMO at all at this time. And those areas are usually found in the high seas. Off the top of my head, I can think of the area off the in the East Atlantic, off the coast of Argentina. And why do we care? Why are we here today to talk about IUU fishing in RFMOs? Well, IUU fishing is estimated to cost countries as much as $23.5 billion worth of fish a year. That is so much money. That is money that is taken out of a coastal state's GDP. That's revenue that does not go back to the people, that does not fund services. And it is money that is needed by all nations, but especially by some of these coastal nations where fish is their main extractive resource. Going back to RFMOs very quickly, when we talk about vessels who are authorized to fish in their RFMO, they're authorized to fish via their member flag state. That flag state transmits the necessary identification information to the RFMO. Most RFMOs have a public list of vessels that are authorized to fish, and depending on the management organization, they'll have a variety of identifying information, pictures, call signs, IMO numbers, etc. And then enforcement of fishing regulations within that RFMO is usually a mix of coastal or island state regulations, RFMO enforcement rules, and then through high seas enforcement by the member nations of those RFMOs.
Thank you for the brief introductions to kick us off. So let's go into some discussion questions here. Do you think RFMOs have done a good job of managing their targeted fisheries, and what could make them more effective?
So I think the way that RFMOs are constructed, they are doing a decent job. I think Esther specifically is in a better position to answer this part of the question, though, given that she works directly with RFMOs for the majority of her work. However, I think some of the ways they have to make decisions are difficult. A lot of RFMOs do consensus-based decision-making. Large, difficult decisions are sometimes tabled for later. And if one country is uncomfortable with a measure that's been put forward, it is less likely that that measure is going to be voted on by the entire body and will move forward. In terms of managing their fisheries and stopping IUU fishing, I think there's always more stuff that can be done. You can always have more human observers. I know it's hard with COVID, and being a human observer is probably one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. That's a really hard ask. But they also could adopt more technology to confirm the type of fish being caught. I think that's something that's really important. But beyond decision-making processes, which I don't think are going to change anytime soon, I think RFMOs need to embrace more transparency initiatives, like requesting beneficial ownership information on the vessels that the flag state puts forward for authorization. This is it's a really big ask. It's difficult information to collect. Some flag states are not collecting that information on their vessels. So that's a tall order, but I think it's something that really does need to move forward, be asked, and I think they really need to move forward on it. And then just in general, I will always say RFMOs can always share more information amongst themselves. I will always say the number one thing to do is share more information. Esther?
Yeah, first I want to say kudos to Christine for saying that we had a brief introduction. At the end of my spiel about RFMOs, I was like, gosh, I feel like I've been talking for a while, and it's hard to condense a lot of this because you're like, there's so many countries, there's so many regions, there's so many stocks and management measures. So thank you for the generous comment, Christine. And then before adding to what you just said, Gina, I think 2 quick notes to understand about RFMOs, to take a step back a little bit, is they were formed to execute agreements under the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement and the United Nations Convention for Law of the Sea. So those were the international agreements they were formed under, but they've mostly failed to prevent overfishing and maintain healthy fish stocks. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. I think one thing to keep in mind is these RFMOs were the main tuna RFMOs that we're talking about here. They were established when ocean resources were believed to be virtually unlimited. So it was more of like a group of countries getting together to divvy up fish stocks versus a structure to actually limit fishing effectively. And then within these RFMOs, you have the secretariat. So this is the group of staff members who make sure everything runs accordingly, make sure that agendas are smoothed out and that members are coming together to discuss urgent matters. They're also usually overworked and sometimes understaffed. And in some cases, they have to carry out some of the work that the flag states are supposed to do, like verifying reported fisheries data or detailing some of the needs for enforcement. So you might ask yourself why they have to step in and do this, the secretariat staff versus the flag states, why they aren't performing their duties. And this can be because members lack the political will or really clear incentive to decrease the number of vessels authorized to fish in a particular area. They also might not want to set catch limits or make decisions that are just based on the scientific advice, because that could then constrain their national fishing or other domestic processing industries. So while to us as outsiders, it might seem, somewhat straightforward, everyone getting together to agree on sustainable fisheries, it's also worthwhile to keep in mind tuna is a $40 billion industry, and more than half of that comes from the Pacific. So you can always expect some competing interests when you get these countries together. Before we completely write off RFMOs, even with all of that in mind, it's important to note that this is an international body, or they are international bodies that are responsible for managing certain fish stocks. And this is where countries come together to make these decisions. This is where everyone has agreed to come to the table, and the discussions might be slow, but slowly the plan is to move towards supporting a healthy, resilient marine ecosystem. Slowly but surely, I tell myself.
All right, so we touched a little bit on COVID and fisheries observers. What are some of the other major concerns about fisheries management that are kind of hot topics right now, whether it's climate change, overfishing, etc.?
My job is to say IUU fishing. So I'm going to say IUU fishing. I think that is definitely something that is one of the major concerns for me. But it's more than just detecting dark targets, which I think gets lost. We hear a lot about technology that is developed to find vessels that are fishing with their AIS transponders off. And I think that's important. But what we really need to start focusing on is the unreported piece of IUU fishing. So the Foreign Fisheries Agency, which is a management body in the made up of the Pacific Island states. They just came out with a report in the middle of December. I want to say like December 21st of last year. So that states that 89% of the IUU fishing that happens in their waters is actually misrepresentation of caught fish. Only 5% of IUU fishing is from unlicensed fishing. And so I think Esther mentioned it before, but since RFMOs really tend to rely on self-reported fishing data from the fishing vessel, flag state, and then to the RFMO, that creates a lot of opportunities for misrepresentation to occur, either on accident, because there's just a mistake in tracking fish that are taken out of the water and onto the boat, or on purpose. So misrepresentation, mislabeling, misinvoicing, however you want to say it, that contributes to the much larger problems of corruption and fraud all over the world, especially if those misrepresented fish come out of another country's exclusive economic zone. Again, like I said before, that all takes money out of the coastal or the island state's budget, which then has a cascading effect for areas well beyond fish in fisheries. Misrepresenting your fish also has like the secondary sort of consequence that we don't really know how much the distant water fishing nations are actually fishing. So I think just in terms of keeping the fish stocks as healthy as possible in those RFMOs, we really need to start looking harder at how do we stop that misrepresentation of catch.
Yeah, and I am not going to disagree with Gina. IU fishing is particularly important because it contributes to overfishing, which is one of the greatest threats facing the ocean. I think the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reported in 2018 that a third of all fish stocks are overfished. And we all know if COVID's taught us anything, it's that we're all connected, and the same goes for all the fish. So there are ramifications for the overfishing of these fish stocks to all other marine species, the whole ecosystem. And so I think that's one of our key takeaways. But at the same time, these countries that are active at the RFMOs might not have clear rules to sustainably manage these stocks. And I think this is one of the key factors behind declines in fish populations, as well as species that are caught along with the target species, so like caught accidentally, like sharks, turtles, and seabirds. I think one of the efforts, though, worth highlighting is the development of harvest strategies. So here you have pre-agreed frameworks for managing fish stocks. And here you take a lot of the guesswork and political debates out of this conversation, because the management decisions are based on science and policies go into effect based on certain population thresholds that are reported. So this is, moving, I think, forward from the current process of a political debate to determine which policies or management measures to enforce for different fish stocks. And then if Darren could go ahead and pop up slide 3, another effort, and this I work directly on, is a longline reform. And here is a fishing gear. So longline is one of the 2 most commonly used commercial fishing gears. You have lines with a bunch of hooks going up to 60 miles. And the other commercial fishing gear is per seine vessels. They have about 100% observer coverage at a bunch of the tuna RFMOs. But for longline vessels, they only have about 5%. So 95% of these activities are virtually unmonitored. And so this is what we're working toward at the RFMOs, to increase this monitoring so that you're collecting all the information related to target and a lot of the bycatch species. Thank you, Darren. And then, you can't talk about huge threats facing the ocean without talking about climate change. And that's especially pertinent in the Pacific, because recent reports that have come out, I think it was a study in nature.com, that talked about how climate change was forcing tuna out of the exclusive economic zones of the Pacific Islands into the high seas. So this means moving to areas of less oversight, which can create opportunities to exacerbate illegal fishing. But then on the other side, it also reduces economic benefits to these Pacific Island countries who rely on licensing fees from the distant water fishing fleets who operate in their EEZs. So a lot of effects coming out of that. And I guess this goes back to what Gina had mentioned about the economic consequences of some of these activities.
Thank you both. So kind of going back to RFMOs, since most of these RFMOs make consensus-based decisions, does this make the decision-making process too slow to implement effective action?
You know, I liken this to an extended family vacation, and I feel like this will resonate with people because I just came back from my holiday break and I felt like I encountered this a lot, where you have a whole group of people trying to agree where they want to go for dinner because everyone has their preference. Of course, at the RFMOs, it's different because the stakes are a lot higher. And, you know, at the RFMOs, you have multiple members. At WCPFC, you have 26 members and then 17 on top of that who are territories or cooperating non-members. And then in ICAT in the Atlantic, you have 50 members. So that's one piece that definitely slows down decision making. And then looking at the structure of RFMOs, they usually have some sort of scientific committee that gathers data to help guide the establishment of, say, sustainable catch levels for various species. And then you also have a bunch of subcommittees that work on separate issues, some working on compliance or data collection. And then these bodies make recommendations that are then proposed and, if we're lucky, adopted at the actual RFMO commission meetings. And these usually happen annually. And that's where the consensus comes in because everyone has to agree in order for that progress to be made. And if you think about it, there might be other ways to advance decision-making processes at RFMOs. At the same time, if you consider an opt-out decision-making process, that can prove to be ineffective. So by opt-out, I mean out of 20 members, or say 25, 3 decide that they don't want to stop the measure from progressing forward, but they will opt out of it. That can be ineffective if the 3 that decide they don't want to join in are the ones that are doing the activities that measure is trying to regulate. So then that makes it not a very effective way to move forward. And then there's also just a lot of issues there in terms of leveling the playing field between members and so on. And then another decision-making process that comes up, I think, a few times is voting. And in some of my work, I've worked with the CITES, so that's for the International Trade in Endangered Species. And they meet every 2 to 3 years, and they come together with a very clear mandate on listing species, and countries vote. And there's measures in place to restrict trade and enforcement to accompany these agreements. RFMOs, though, are a little bit different. It is a little bit more nuanced there. And so the same process isn't always applied. But at ICAT, for example, in the Atlantic, their convention text does allow for voting as a decision-making tool. And it's, I think, 2/3 would allow, 2/3 majority would allow a measure to be adopted. But still today, they usually use a consensus-based process as a general rule. And then, of course, this leads to postponement of decisions, sometimes on very urgent matters. The same goes for in the Eastern Pacific Ocean at ITTC, where members ended their meetings in 2021 without a measure in place for the region for tropical tuna. So you had this lapse in time where there was no measure in place. It was kind of like a free-for-all. But luckily, they had multiple meetings after that over the year and then finally agreed to a measure. And each time they met, it was usually just 1 or 2 countries that was stopping everyone agreeing on the measure. So yes. Yeah, I think consensus-based definitely is slowing things down.
Hey, Esther, can I ask you a follow-up question on that?
Mm-hmm.
So if a RFMO like ICAT, if they have a rule that allows for like a 2/3 majority to adopt a measure, why don't they vote? Like, why do they decide to use consensus-based decision-making as their general rule when they can vote?
Right. It's a good question. I remember going from my first studies meeting to my first ICAT meeting and asking myself the same thing. It gets thrown out there every now and again, but almost as a threat. Like a country will bring up, then maybe we should get to a point where we should vote on this measure. But in the last 4 years, I've never actually seen that eventuate. And this could be due to concerns over horse trading practices, and say a member would have to say, let's vote on this issue. And if they do that, they then open the gates for other measures that say country B will say, let's vote on this issue. And country A really doesn't want to move forward with that measure because it has detrimental effects for their domestic fisheries. So it's kind of, I don't want to say tit for tat, but countries don't want to call for a vote, knowing that that same mechanism might get them ousted out of another measure that they have, particular interest in. So then, again, that stops a lot of the policies from moving forward.
Thank you. I did not know that. I appreciate that. And I appreciate that knowledge. On my side, in the most diplomatic way I can say this, I don't think this is a particularly effective way to make progress. And I think we are at a point where within RFMOs, we need to see some dramatic progress. And what I think people forget when we are talking about companies and fishers who fish illegally, when we're talking about bad actors in the fisheries space, we forget that the practices that they engage in, they evolve those practices over time. And so RFMOs working at the slow speed that they are not in a position to stay up to date on the way bad actors operate. They are not in a position to make the necessary changes to their enforcement mechanisms, or like up their information sharing or whatever they need to do. They're not in a position to do that effectively, or even, I don't know, what's below quickly. They take too much time, and so these bad actors can evolve their practices twice, maybe 3 times before the RFMO can catch up to that first evolution. And so it's a constant cycle. And so one of the things that we need to be, I personally would like to see more of, I would like to see the RFMOs move a little faster in their decision-making process.
Trying to make that happen, Gina. We're trying.
Yes. All right. Now, Gina, you touched on sharing information earlier, so let's kind of go back to that real quick. What kind of enforcement and information sharing mechanisms do RFMOs have in order to deter vessels from engaging in IUU fishing?
So Esther touched on it earlier at the start of this webinar. She talked about the fish stocks agreement, which is what created the RFMOs in the first place. The fish stocks agreement allows for member states to engage in enforcement activities, including interdiction and boarding of fishing vessels in the convention area. So, for example, the United States is a member of the WCPFC, and if the Coast Guard is doing an operation in the convention area, it can do boardings of fishing vessels that they suspect of IUU fishing. So, in fact, I just had the press release up a little while ago. The Coast Guard cutter Juniper finished a 45-day patrol through the central WCPFC convention area in October. So those are things that are done regularly. The RFMO then will report any violations that the enforcement vehicles found. They'll report that to the flag state of that vessel, and the flag state is responsible for promptly taking the necessary enforcement action. So I think in the fish stocks agreement, they have to report it within, they either have to report it within 3 days, or flag state has to like come back and acknowledge it within 3 days. The fish stocks agreement does say that these have to be taken, action has to be taken quickly. I don't really know, like in practice, how quickly that action is taken. So a vessel that is found to be fishing illegally in the convention area, it can be banned from fishing. It can be placed on an IUU list. IUU vessel lists are different depending on the RFMO. Once you're on that list, though, it is difficult depending on the RFMO. It can be very hard to get off. And there's also, I guess I would call it like almost like a level of embarrassment, like a social shame that happens when like a flag state has a vessel on that IUU list. And so they don't want to have a vessel on that IUU list, and usually they'll do what's necessary to have it taken off. Other enforcement activities, vessel monitoring systems. VMS provides a pretty high degree of detailed and verifiable information on the vessel location, more so than AIS, which is public. VMS is more and more that's being required by fisheries managers around the world. But sharing that data is much more difficult than sharing AIS data. VMS data is not public, except in pretty rare cases, like the VMS data you find on the Global Fishing Watch platform is public to an extent, but some of that data is it's not a real-time data set. So sharing that VMS data is not automatic. And then RFMOs, sometimes they'll have ways to get that VMS data to the member state, but it can be through like a rather complicated process depending on the RFMO. So I've been told that like the WCPFC, the RFMO can receive some VMS data through an existing relationship they have with SPC, but then that VMS data is really only put together in like an annual report, and it's not something that really can be used as like an enforcement tool.
Yeah, and I'll add on the technology front, Gina touched on AIS, and this was initially introduced as a collision avoidance tool, but has now been used to track vessels, and there are actors like Global Fishing Watch, which has really harnessed the power of automatic identification systems and they've incorporated some sophisticated machine learning and AI tools to give a richer understanding of vessel activities. But it's also worth noting that not all vessels are required to use this, and the ones that do they don't always transmit AIS. So while it is a useful tool, I think there's still bits that need to be improved upon and acted on. And Gina, maybe you could talk more a little bit about some of that work and leading up to the carrier vessel portal.
So the carrier vessel portal, I think you had mentioned it earlier in this webinar. It's a joint project between Pew and Global Fishing Watch that really focuses on transshipping and RFMOs and determining what constitutes loitering versus what could be an actual transshipping event. I see it's been popped into the chat. Oh no, it hasn't. But somebody from Global Fishing Watch is actually on this RFMO who can pop the carrier vessel portal link into the chat, and I would very much appreciate that. But it's a great tool. It's a very good tool to see historical trends, what has been happening in those AORs, those RFMO convention areas. Thank you, Allison. And yeah, no, I think it's a great tool. Pew and Global Fishing Watch worked on it for a couple of years. I know that some of the RFMOs, some of the tuna RFMOs are using it more as part of their own, not real-time enforcement necessarily, but using it as a way to see, it's like a 30,000 foot view of what is happening in their convention area over a period of 12 months at a time.
And then if we're talking about tools, obviously going to put in a plug for electronic monitoring. So these are EM systems where you have a centralized monitor and cameras on board with gear sensors and GPS, and basically they're able to provide information to fisheries authorities. So they're able to monitor what's happening out at sea remotely. And when properly designed, they can collect a lot of information that's effectively transmitted, stored, and analyzed by the RFMOs to inform a lot of the decisions that are being made there. And there's a lot of momentum around this right now. As you know, we've talked about COVID and the restrictions pulling a lot of observers off the vessels. So electronic monitoring is sort of a tool that can step in. It's definitely not a one-for-one, but it does provide some fisheries information that's useful for the decision-making process. And if Darren could pop up slide 4, this gives you a sense of where the 4 main tuna RFMOs are in developing an EM program. And I thought this would be a good snapshot to give everyone a sense of what the process is at these RFMOs to put together a program. So basically, decision making starts, or the process starts with a country bringing a proposal, sometimes multiple countries with a co-sponsor proposal, to an annual commission meeting of that RFMO. And then if we're lucky and there's consensus, they can then move forward with that work, which usually is done in the form of establishing a working group. That working group is usually made up of members of the RFMO, interested members who will help draft a measure or standards related to that program. This then travels to the subcommittees. I talked about subcommittees previously. You have the scientific ones, the compliance ones. The relevant subcommittees will review these measures that were developed by the working group. And if the timing all works out and there's agreement, that then goes back to the next annual commission meeting. And then here, you have to get consensus again to actually adopt the now new measure that's incorporated all the feedback. And so this process takes a minimum of about 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, it's gone through this whole cycle. It usually takes just 1 or 2 countries to be a holdout. Say they weren't part of the working group because they weren't interested at first, but then now that the measure is presented at the proposed at the meeting, they have issues with 1 or 2 pieces of it. That can end up holding up progress for another year, and then it goes through this cycle again. So I think this is a good snapshot to give folks an idea of what the decision-making process is, how long it takes, and kind of the jumps that folks need to go through before things are actually adopted and progress is made. Thank you for sharing that, Darren. Before we leave this point, your question mentioned information sharing. And I think this is a real key point here because vessels operate over multiple jurisdictions. We've seen this time and time again. And I think a good example to look into here, specific practice, is transshipment. And this is, like I mentioned, usually involves the transfer of fish between vessels. It's common practice globally, especially in the Pacific, and especially with long line vessels. The gear types that I talked about having only 5% observed coverage, they're usually involved in transshipment. It's high value, low volume fishery, and transshipment helps them get catch to ports sooner, closer to the markets, fresher days, higher market value. So there's an actual point behind a lot of the transshipments that's happening. On the flip side of it, a lot of these activities happen in the high seas and outside of the view and reach of authorities. So they create an environment for other illicit activities because a lot of these vessels already are fully monitored, the longline vessels. These transshipments can also create an environment to transfer illegally caught fish, mix in legally and illegally caught fish, but then also maybe move drugs, weapons, and so on. We've seen anecdotal information and reports here and there from crew members, and we're working with the Environment Justice Foundation right now to publish reports that actually looks at case studies that links transshipment to IUU fishing, labor abuses, other crimes at sea, and even wildlife trade. So if folks are interested, we see that being published later this year, and I'm happy to share it. But in doing a lot of this work, we found that a lot of the transshipments occur right outside EEZs. So if Darren wants to pop up our last slide, slide 5, you will see that a lot of this, and this is information collected through automatic identification systems, so AIS, and a lot of the transshipments tend to occur right outside the EEZ bubbles, and then a lot of them also occur within the overlap area. So here it's between the Western Central Pacific Ocean and the Eastern Pacific Ocean, between two RFMOs, WCPFC and IATTC. And then what's interesting here is you can have multiple management regimes in place for these same waters. And this can cause some confusion. It's not always clear which rules the vessels that are transshipping or operating in these areas are following, nor if that information is then being shared with the neighboring RFMOs. So I think this lends itself to another reason why there needs to be more practical information sharing, not just within the RFMOs, but also between them. Thank you, Darren.
All right, thank you both. So I'm starting to see a lot of questions pop up. So let's jump to some of the audience questions here. Prior to Q&A, we will be posting a short poll. So please take a few moments to complete the poll on your screen to help us to improve our program. All right, so I'll just kind of start peppering you with some of these, Gina and Esther. So I hope you're ready. We have some good ones. So how can we balance the need to regulate catches to preserve ocean stocks with the need to feed a growing world population dependent on ocean-based protein?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm happy to take this one. I think, and that's true, like fisheries for a lot of people, it's an important source of protein. It is an important part of the economy, especially if we're looking at coastal states in the Pacific. But at the same time, we kind of need to look at this long-term sustainability. And that's where the harvest strategies I had mentioned comes in, because you basically have a process in place. And sometimes it does lock you into hard decisions where you're going to have to decrease quotas because this is what the science is saying. It is designed, though, to ensure that there's long-term sustainability. So while it might mean some cuts right now, it is based on scientific data, and it's supposed to mean that if we make these decisions now, we should be better in terms of sustainability in the long run.
If I could just jump in real quick, I think that this question really illuminates the whole topic of the webinar about RFMOs and some of the questions about decision making. These are, like Esther said, these are really hard decisions to make because you're essentially telling a member state or a fishing group that they cannot fish as much as they were last year, and there's going to be a period of however many years they can't fish as much as they were. Those are really hard decisions to make. They're not popular when they go back home, and they've made those decisions. And so the way that decision making happens at RFMOs, it enables member states to continuously say, we know that there are problems, but we're going to keep the existing quotas for another year, and we'll continue these conversations, and we'll continue to do this research. And it's like a self-perpetuating cycle. And so in order to have fish stocks that that member states and coastal states and everybody can rely on to feed themselves, RFMOs need to start making those hard decisions now, because if they don't start making them now, in 5 to 10 years, it will be too late to make those decisions, and they will wish they had a time machine.
And what region of the world sees the largest amount of IUUF activity?
That's a tough question, because the activity in itself, the nature of it happens so that you can't always see all of the IUU fishing that's happening. And I think there's no region that's exempt from it. And there are different, there are different operations for IUU fishing at different regions. So I think it would be really difficult to answer that. But Gina is our IUU expert, so I'm going to hand it over to her.
Thank you for kicking that to me. I saw that come into the chat and I was like, that's a good question. And I can't give you a hard and fast answer. What I can tell you is that this is a question that NGOs around the world have been studying. I know Pew looked at this question a couple of years ago, and it's something that is very difficult to quantify. I think we see more IUU fishing happening in areas, and I'll probably get myself in trouble for saying this because I may be wrong, but we see it happening more off the coast of Africa. We see it happening in areas of Asia, and we can see it, but we don't have a really great way to quantify it right now. So I think I'm actually wondering if Christine, if I could get the name of the person who asked that question. I'm going to see if I can do a little bit of research offline, and I will see if I can get back to them with a better answer.
Sounds good. We'll get that to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. So considering the voluntary nature of RFMOs, is there any history or a situation where a nation whose vessels are fishing in an RFMO area simply refuse to participate in the relevant RFMO and adhere to its regulations?
Right. So as I mentioned, each of the RFMOs, they have these subcommittees that look at, you have the scientific subcommittees, and then they also have compliance subcommittees. And then the compliance group, their job is to meet annually and then make sure that everyone's reporting their data, fisheries data that they need to, and that they're complying. Usually there's an annual report that countries have to provide, and it goes through all the measures that, say, WCPFC has agreed to, and they need to say yes or no if it applies to them, and then how they're implementing it. So there are these mechanisms in place, but at the same time, it could be very easy to say that you are complying with something if you're not. And if you don't provide these annual reports, they're usually, unfortunately, it has to be after a few years. If like 3 years consecutively, one country has not provided this report, then that usually raises a red flag. The compliance committee takes that to the commission meeting, and then that ends up being a discussion of whether or not this member is doing their job. And so that's what the current process is. But like I had mentioned, the staff is, the secretariat for the RFMOs, they usually are understaffed. So then it's on top of their regular job to then go through, make sure that these countries are doing what they're supposed to do. And then that's where the gaps fall in. And some countries might be able to get away with not always complying or saying they comply if they don't in their annual reports.
Thank you. Another question about transshipment. So how can we get RFMOs to ban transshipment at sea? Is that even possible?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be the route. I know that there's been a lot of conversations, and I believe even at Pew, our stance was, if you're not going to manage it correctly, ban transshipment. But this is a big piece of a lot of the long line industry that I had mentioned. It is an efficient way for them to get catch to market sooner, and so at this point, I don't see that happening anytime soon. If anything, what it does is it pushes the countries that do transship out of the conversation, because you're at one extreme. And really, I think for us, the middle ground is fine. If you're going to continue transshipping, just make sure that there are reporting and monitoring measures in place so that it's not also being an avenue to launder IUU caught fish and then all the other illicit activities that we talked about. So really, I think that the push here, the effort is to improve overall transshipment oversight at sea so that so that you don't have to ban it, basically.
Thank you. So I think we are coming to the close of our webinar. So I'd like to ask our speakers to provide us with closing comments. Specifically, what advice or takeaways do you have for our security practitioners and policymakers in the Indo-Pacific region? And I'll add on to that with any kind of recommendations for the RFMOs, flag, port states.
Sure.
You want to start?
I'm happy to go. That's fine. COVID, again, top of mind for everyone. So I think it's taught us a lot of activities are connected. We're all connected, if that's like one of the biggest takeaways from COVID. And then the same goes for fish species and the overall marine ecosystem. It goes for the connection between fisheries management and the ability for coastal states to know what activities are happening, within their waters. And then that, of course, is, a link to overall maritime security. So there's all these connections between a lot of the work that we do. And so it's really important that nations come together with the idea of working to progress measures for the common good. Because at the end of the day, fisheries are a public resource. And it's on all of us to ensure that the oceans are sustainable for years to come. But for the most part, it's mostly on the fisheries managers that are making these decisions.
On my end, I would say for the RFMOs, and this would also go to the port states and the flag states, everybody needs to keep an eye on emerging trends in the fisheries industry. So we did not get a chance to talk about it today, but going forward, RFMOs, port states, flag states, everybody needs to start paying more attention to the idea and the practice of containerization, which is when fish is caught, processed, boxed, and put on a shipping container, and all this happens on the fishing vessel. And so depending on the port state laws and regulations, once that container is taken off the fishing vessel and it's brought to the port, that container may be exempt from inspection. And that seems like kind of open season on unregulated fishing, along with a whole bunch of convergence crimes, which we did not get to talk about today. But for the people who are on this webinar, one, thank you for listening to me and Esther talk about RFMOs and IUU fishing, but also I would encourage you guys to go to our website, look at the stuff that Pew has done. We are resources for you guys. You guys are maritime security professionals and practitioners. When you come across IUU and RFMO stuff, you guys don't have to be the experts. That's what we do. Always feel free to reach out to us, ask us questions. I can be found on Twitter. APCSS knows our contact information and can send it out if they want to. But yeah, no, reach out to us and ask us questions. That's what we're here for.
Thank you, Gina and Esther, for a great discussion. To our audience, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule today to join us. And mahalo nui loa for your support of our program. Thank you.
Inaka.
Thank you.